Today we're going to use a cardboard loom to weave a yarn tapestry. There's a few items that you need to begin. A piece of paper to draw out your design, tape, warp thread, a pencil, and a pair of scissors. Your design does not need to take up the entire loom. So before you begin warping your loom, the first thing that you need to figure out is how big you want your yarn tapestry to be. So you want to take your piece of paper and you can either fold and measure it or cut it, whatever works better for you. I want mine to be a little bit shorter, so I'm going to take some of that width off of the side. This is just a regular piece of printer paper, and I want mine to be a little bit more narrow. So I'm going to fold down that edge there, and I can either leave it or cut it off. It doesn't really matter. We're just going to be using this as a guide, so it doesn't really matter. You can choose whichever you want. I'm going to cut mine off just to kind of keep it out of the way. All right. Once I have decided on what size I want my tapestry to be, I'm going to use my pencil to sketch out my design. Now I'm going to be creating a mixture of organic lines and straight solid across bands. So you're just going to kind of roughly sketch in. If you're using geometric shapes, it'll be more important that you get all of your shapes drawn in, and you might even want to use a ruler for that. If you can freehand a straight line across, you can use, you can just draw it. If you feel better using a ruler, there's no rule against that either. So I'm going to look at what kind of bands that I want my tapestry to have. And mine actually is not going to go all the way to the bottom. I think I'm going to cut mine off here. And I want to start with some rolling shapes as I kind of figure out what I'm doing here. And the bands don't have to go all the way from one side to the other. You can kind of figure out, and I'm sort of just darkening these in as I'm deciding where I really want them to be. And again, since I'm doing organic shapes, I don't have to worry too much about getting my lines exact. If you are doing geometric shapes like a diamond or a triangle, you do probably want to use a ruler because this will be your guide for your shape. So I'm going to put in a couple of horizontal bands in here and then maybe go back to another wave shape, slightly different than the last time. Maybe I'll pinch one of my waves off here and have this come in from the other side. And the thing that I like about working with organic shapes is you can kind of do whatever strikes you. All right, so once I have my design sort of figured out, I'm going to cut off the end here. So I've got two sections of organic shapes kind of mapped out. I have some horizontal bands across the center, and then I went back to some organic shapes, and then I will end the top level across. So I'm going to take this design now and secure it to my loom with a little bit of tape. And you can tape right over the front of it. It's not going to become a permanent part of the project, so it can come off. I can see right through my tape, my pencil lines here, so that is not a concern for me. If you're using a different kind of tape that you can't see through, you might want to hide it someplace to keep it out of the way. To warp the loom, we're going to be using warp thread. This is a specific thread called warp thread, but you can use really anything to warp your loom. The only thing is you want to make sure that the string that you're using to warp with is not stretchy. So you can see that this string, when I pull on it, it doesn't have a lot of give to it. It really doesn't have any stretch at all. You don't want to use a yarn or a string that has a lot of stretch to it, because you want your warp to stay nice and tight. So you can use thinner or thicker strings for your warp depending on what you want your design to look like. I tend to favor this kind of string when I'm warping a loom, so that's what we're going to be using today. To begin warping our loom, we're going to begin by pulling a little bit of the warp thread off of our spool and attaching the end of the warp thread to the back of the loom. And some people tie it onto the loom. I usually tend to secure with a little bit of tape to the back. So I'm going to start by putting this end, and I want to leave a little bit of an end on there, a little bit of extra warp thread here so that later on when I go to take this off, I have a little bit to work with. So I'm going to start with my end taped to the back, and I'm going to bring it over my design. Let's start right here. Now this doesn't line up exactly with this, but because I'm doing organic shapes, it'll be okay. My design can just kind of come out a little bit. If it bothers you, you can move the tape over and retape it so it lines up exactly. So I'm going to take my warp string and I'm going to go straight down to the groove opposite the first one so that I have a nice level piece. I'm going to go behind that tab on the bottom. So I went into the groove and behind, and I'm going to go up to the top to the groove, behind the tab, and I'm going to continue creating bands on the front. So I have nice long vertical warp threads on the front of my board, but if I flip it over, you'll see that I only have those tiny little lines on the back, no big lines on the back. You don't want to take your warp string and wrap it all the way around the board where you would have long strings on the back. So that will make it incredibly difficult to remove from your loom later. This is just going to be the structure that's going to hold it while we're weaving. We don't want it to be permanently part of our tapestry. So I'm just going to continue making my way to the end. Of my design. And I'm actually going to move my drawing over a little bit because I don't want to add, it starts getting a little wider than I really wanted it. So once I reach the end, I'm going to flip over my loom onto the back, cut again, leave a nice long end to the start and stop. And I'm going to tape that down so it stays out of my way. And then I am just going to lift my drawing here carefully. This might be a little tricky for where your warp is nice and tight. There we go. So I'm just gonna kind of center this. This one's getting kind of caught on the tape, so I'll just lift that up a little bit. And I will recenter. And retape. Now you want to leave a little bit of extra room at the top and the bottom so that you have some room. More room at the bottom than the top is usually better because you need some extra warp string to tie it off when you remove it from the loom. Before we begin weaving our yarn onto our loom, we need to finish a few more things for setup. So having something like a ruler, or if you don't have a ruler, you can use some thick cardboard. Any kind of scrap cardboard will do. You're going to eventually need your long yarn needle and scissors. To start weaving, we want to leave some space at the bottom of our loom where our yarn isn't going to go all the way down to the bottom notches. So the easiest way to do that is to put in a little stopper or a blocker. And the blocker can just be made out of scrap cardboard. If you don't have cardboard, you can fold paper a couple of times to make it thicker, cardstock, something like that, junk mail, anything that you have. You want to find something that is going to be the same size as the space between the bottom of your design and those little notches. So I'm actually going to flip my cardboard over here. I'm going to match this piece of scrap cardboard up at the bottom of my design. Kind of measure about where. Now I can either, if you have a ruler, you can use a ruler to measure. If you don't have a ruler, you can just kind of make some little marks where the nubs are, and then either use the side of your loom as a straight edge, or again, if you do have a ruler, you can connect those little dots, draw a line straight across, and then use your scissors to cut that cardboard. The size we need it. So this piece of cardboard that we're going to be putting at the bottom as a stopper is going to go underneath all the warp strings. So we can just kind of lift these up. So all of the warp strings are on top, and then we're going to slide it down to the bottom where it matches up with the bottom of my paper, and it's going to stop my yarn from going all the way down to the bottom. Now I'm going to add something up at the top that's going to make my life a little bit easier when I begin to weave. So for this, you can use, again, a ruler. You can use a thicker piece of cardboard. This piece of cardboard is kind of thick, but if I was going to use this, I would probably cut it in half and double it to make it a little thicker. I have a plastic ruler, so I'm going to be using this for this part. So with the piece that's going to go at the top, this piece is going to go under every other string. So I'm just going to use my fingers to lift my warp threads, and I'm lifting every other one on top of the ruler and leaving the others underneath. This is going to allow me, when I'm weaving, to easily access one of the rows by tilting my needle up, and it creates what's called the shed, where your needle is going to go through with your yarn nice and easy. So you only have to pick up the every others coming in from one side, and the other side can be used by just tilting the ruler. This is helpful for using, so I'm right-handed, so I would use my right hand to pick up every other string, and I would use this for the left side so that when I pass through, it makes it a little easier because my left hand isn't as coordinated. If you're left-handed, then you would do it the other way around. So for this assignment, it's okay to use yarns of different weights and textures. Sometimes when we're doing craft assignments, it's really important that everything has the same weight yarn, or that it's not one of the textured yarns. But for this assignment, this is a really nice place, especially if you're a crafter or have someone at home who is, to use up little bits and pieces and ends of scrap yarn, because you can use a variety of things. And if you don't have a lot, you can use that for areas on your design that might not be featured as many times, and use the areas that you do have more yarn for, you know, some of the ones that you have a little bit more to work with.